The United States was never supposed to become a nation permanently at war. And yet, for more than half a century, America has fought conflict after conflict across the globe. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, while military bases spread across continents like silent outposts of an empire that officially claims it isn't one. But here's the question almost nobody asks. What if these wars were never exceptions? What if they were the system itself? Because behind every intervention, every humanitarian mission, every operation launched in the name of freedom, there exists an unwritten doctrine that Washington has followed for decades, a doctrine so powerful, presidents obey it, generals protect it, the media rarely challenges it, and the American public barely sees it. Washington Rules calls it the invisible architecture of permanent war, and once you understand it, you can never look at American foreign policy the same way again. If you enjoy military history, geopolitics, and the hidden mechanics of global power, subscribe now, because this channel goes beyond the battlefield and into the systems controlling it. This story does not begin with Iraq or Afghanistan. It begins much earlier. Right after World War II, the United States emerged stronger than any military power in human history. Europe was shattered. Japan was devastated. The Soviet Union was rising. And Washington faced a decision that would define the next century: return to peace or prepare for endless confrontation. American leaders chose the second option, quietly, systematically, permanently. The Cold War became the perfect justification. Fear of communism allowed military planners, intelligence agencies, and political elites to construct an entirely new national identity, one built around global military dominance. For the first time in its history, America would maintain enormous standing armies during peacetime, permanent overseas deployments, permanent alliances, permanent readiness for war. This was not temporary. It became doctrine, and over time, it evolved into something bigger than defense. It became belief, the belief that the United States had both the right and the obligation to intervene anywhere on Earth. A crisis in Asia, a coup in Latin America, an insurgency in the Middle East, a dictator in Africa. Everything became connected to American security. And once that mindset took hold, there was no clear endpoint anymore. Because if peace depends on controlling the entire world, then war never truly ends. What made this system dangerous was not only military power, it was how normal it became. Generation after generation grew up watching interventions presented as necessary, moral, unavoidable. Politicians from both parties repeated the same language. Defense budgets exploded. Military contractors gained enormous influence. Television transformed war into spectacle. And slowly, permanent war stopped feeling permanent. It just felt normal. But beneath the speeches and patriotic slogans, cracks were already forming. Vietnam exposed the limits of American power. Iraq exposed the cost of strategic arrogance. Afghanistan exposed what happens when a superpower enters a war it no longer understands. Trillions spent, thousands dead, entire regions destabilized, and still, the machine kept moving forward. Because according to Bacevich, Washington wasn't simply reacting to threats. It had become addicted to military solutions themselves. And that changes everything. Because if war becomes policy, then peace becomes the disruption. Next, we uncover the unwritten rules that trapped America inside an endless cycle of intervention, and why almost nobody in power was willing to stop it. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was gone. The Cold War was over. For a brief moment, many Americans believed the age of massive military confrontation had finally ended. No more existential enemy. No more nuclear standoff dividing the planet in half. No more reason for permanent mobilization. This should have been the moment Washington stepped back. Instead, it accelerated. Because something strange happened after America won the Cold War. The system built for survival suddenly needed a new purpose, and powerful institutions rarely dismantled themselves, voluntarily. The Pentagon still commanded enormous budgets. Defense contractors still depended on conflict. Intelligence agencies still expanded their reach. Politicians still gained power by appearing strong against threats. So a new doctrine quietly emerged. America would not simply defend the world order. America would manage it, militarily. This became one of the core Washington rules. The belief that global stability depends on constant American force projection, not diplomacy first, not restraint, not strategic patience, force, fast, decisive, overwhelming. And nowhere was this mindset more visible than during the Gulf War in 1991. For many Americans, it looked like a perfect military victory. Precision airstrikes, advanced technology, minimal American casualties. A dictator pushed back in weeks. To Washington's military elite, the war felt like proof that the United States had unlocked a new era of warfare, one where American power could reshape entire regions quickly and efficiently. But success created something dangerous: confidence without limits. The lesson many leaders absorbed was not caution. It was that military intervention worked, again and again. And once policymakers start believing war is efficient, clean, and controllable, intervention becomes easier to justify every single time. A humanitarian crisis? Send troops? A rogue regime? Launch airstrikes? Terrorist threat? Invade before the threat grows. The logic always sounded urgent, temporary, necessary, but the outcomes rarely matched the promises. And the American public, exhausted by complexity, often accepted the simplified version presented to them. America acts, America wins, America protects freedom. But reality on the ground was far messier. Every intervention created new instability. Every power vacuum opened space for new enemies. Every limited operation carried consequences far beyond the original mission. And yet the system kept rewarding escalation. If you've made it this far, comment "permanent war" below, because most people never realize how deeply military doctrine shapes the modern world until they start connecting the dots. Then came the turning point that changed everything forever. September 11th, 2001. In a single morning, fear transformed American foreign policy overnight. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people, but politically, they also erased the final barriers limiting military expansion. Now Washington had something even more powerful than anti-communism: the war on terror. An enemy without borders, without uniforms, without a clear endpoint. And that made the conflict uniquely dangerous. Because how do you win a war against a tactic? You can invade a country, destroy an army, topple a regime. But terror itself, that can justify military operations almost anywhere on Earth. Suddenly, interventions were no longer measured in months or years. They became indefinite. Afghanistan was only the beginning. Soon, Iraq followed. Then drone campaigns, special operations, black sites, surveillance expansions, counter-terror missions across multiple continents. The battlefield had become global and permanent. What frightened Bacevich most was not only the wars themselves, it was how little resistance remained inside Washington. Democrats and Republicans disagreed on many things, but endless military engagement? On that issue, the establishment often spoke with one voice. The real debate was rarely whether America should intervene, only how. And while soldiers fought overseas, something else was happening back home. Most Americans had become disconnected from war itself. A tiny percentage of families carried the burden of combat. The economy continued normally. Daily life remained untouched for most citizens. War had become background noise, distant, professionalized, almost invisible, and that may have been the most dangerous transformation of all, because once a democracy stops feeling the cost of war, what exactly prevents endless war from continuing forever? Next, we enter the heart of the machine itself, the alliance between politics, industry, media, and military power that turned intervention into America's default response to almost every global crisis. At the center of America's permanent war system was not one president, not one political party, not even one military branch. It was an entire ecosystem, a network of politicians, defense corporations, intelligence officials, media institutions, think tanks, and military planners, all reinforcing the same worldview over and over again. And once this machine gained momentum, stopping it became almost impossible, because permanent war creates permanent profit. After 9/11, defense spending exploded to levels few Americans truly understood. Trillions of dollars flowed into weapons systems, private contractors, intelligence programs, surveillance technology, and overseas operations. Entire industries expanded around conflict itself. companies built missiles. Private firms handled logistics. Contractors replaced soldiers in massive numbers. Technology corporations developed surveillance systems capable of tracking entire populations. War was no longer just military policy. It had become economic infrastructure. And the more money involved, the harder it became to question the system publicly. Criticizing intervention could suddenly sound unpatriotic. Questioning military expansion could be framed as weakness. Doubting intelligence claims could damage political careers. Fear became fuel. But there was another layer most people never noticed: the media. During major conflicts, television transformed warfare into a continuous spectacle. Missile camera footage, dramatic music, maps, retired generals explaining strategy beside glowing graphics. War became something audiences consumed nightly, distant enough to feel unreal, cinematic enough to feel controlled. The language changed, too. Civilian deaths became collateral damage. Invasions became liberation efforts. Bombing campaigns became precision operations. Words softened reality. And softened reality makes endless conflict easier to tolerate. But the battlefield itself told a different story. In Iraq, the initial invasion was fast. The occupation was not. Washington believed Saddam Hussein would fall, democracy would spread, and the Middle East would stabilize under American influence. Instead, Iraq collapsed into chaos. Insurgencies multiplied. Sectarian violence exploded. Terror groups adapted faster than military planners expected. And one of those groups would eventually evolve into ISIS. The war designed to eliminate instability had created even more of it. Afghanistan followed a similar pattern. The Taliban fell quickly in 2001, but the mission kept expanding. Counterterrorism became nation-building. Nation-building became endless occupation. Endless occupation became strategic confusion. Year after year, officials claimed progress was being made. Year after year, the war continued. 20 years later, America withdrew, and the Taliban returned to power almost immediately. 2 decades, thousands of lives, trillions of dollars, gone within days. That moment shattered something important. Not only confidence in strategy, but confidence in the entire idea that military power alone could reshape complex societies. And yet, even after these failures, the system itself survived. Why? Because Washington rules were never built around winning quickly. They were built around maintaining global military dominance indefinitely. That distinction changes everything. The objective was not always peace. The objective was control, presence, influence, projection of power. And once you understand that, many decisions that once looked irrational suddenly begin making perfect sense. If this video is changing how you see American power, subscribe now. This channel breaks down the military strategies, doctrines, and hidden structures most documentaries never fully explain. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Bacevich's argument is this: permanent war doesn't only transform foreign countries, it transforms the nation fighting the wars too. Surveillance expands, civil liberties shrink, military language enters politics, fear becomes permanent, emergency powers normalize. A country built on constitutional restraint slowly adapts itself to endless conflict. And over time, citizens stop asking where the limits are supposed to be, because the logic of permanent war always demands one more operation, one more deployment, one more enemy. The machine can never fully stop. Stopping would mean admitting the doctrine itself failed, and empires rarely admit failure voluntarily. Next, we reach the final stage of the story, the deeper warning behind Washington rules, and the question haunting America today: can a superpower built around endless war still remain a democracy in the long run? By the time Andrew Bacevich wrote Washington Rules, America had already spent decades preparing for wars that never truly ended. But for Bacevich, the greatest danger was not military defeat abroad. It was moral exhaustion at home, because permanent war changes how a nation thinks. At first, war feels exceptional, temporary, a response to crisis. But after enough years, it becomes routine. New presidents enter office promising change. Then the briefings begin: threat assessments, intelligence reports, alliances, military obligations, strategic risks, and almost every leader reaches the same conclusion: maintain the system. Not because they are necessarily evil, not because they secretly want chaos, but because dismantling a permanent war structure built over generations is politically terrifying. What happens if America pulls back and a crisis erupts? What happens if restraint is interpreted as weakness? What happens if another attack happens after military reductions? Fear traps decision-makers inside the same cycle, and fear is one of the most powerful weapons in politics. That is why Washington rules survived Vietnam, survived Iraq, survived Afghanistan. Even strategic failure was not enough to break the doctrine, because the doctrine had become identity. America no longer simply had a military. America had begun defining itself through military dominance. The strongest army, the largest defense budget, the global protector, the indispensable nation. But history carries a warning about powers that depend too heavily on force. Again and again, empires believed military superiority could solve political problems permanently. Again and again, reality proved otherwise. The British Empire, the Soviet Union, Napoleon's France. Power creates confidence. Confidence creates overreach. Overreach creates exhaustion. And exhaustion eventually reaches the center itself. Bacevich understood this personally. He was not an outside activist shouting slogans from a distance. He was a former U.S. Army officer, a military historian, a man whose own son died fighting in Iraq. That loss changed the weight of every word he wrote, because for him, these wars were never abstract geopolitical games. They carried human cost. Young soldiers deployed repeatedly, families shattered by combat trauma, entire generations sent into conflicts with unclear endings. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the machine continued operating almost automatically. Briefings, budgets, operations, escalations, as if permanent war had become self-sustaining. And maybe the most uncomfortable question in this entire story is this: what if endless war is not a mistake, but the natural outcome of a global superpower trying to preserve dominance forever? Because maintaining supremacy across the planet requires constant readiness, constant intervention, constant enemies. Without threats, the justification weakens, and that creates a dangerous incentive structure where conflict itself becomes strategically useful, not necessarily invented, but continuously expanded. This is why Washington rules remains so controversial even today. It forces Americans to confront a possibility many would rather avoid, that the United States may no longer know how to exist without war somewhere in the world. And if that is true, then peace is no longer the default state. War is. The terrifying part is not that America became powerful. It's that permanent war slowly became normal, accepted so gradually that most people barely noticed it happening. And history shows that when nations stop questioning endless conflict, the cost eventually reaches everyone. If you enjoyed this breakdown, leave a like, subscribe, and comment your opinion below. Can a superpower maintain global dominance without becoming trapped in permanent war? Because the answer to that question may shape the future of the entire world. Even after the failures, even after the trillions spent, even after the images of chaotic withdrawals and collapsing governments, the doctrine never truly disappeared. Because Washington rules was never just about one war. It was about a mindset deeply embedded inside American power itself. Look at the world today. Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, the Middle East, cyber warfare, drone warfare, artificial intelligence entering military strategy faster than governments can regulate it. The battlefield keeps evolving, but the instinct remains the same. Project power first, contain threats early, maintain dominance at all costs. And that raises a chilling possibility for the future. The next permanent war may not look like Iraq or Afghanistan. It may be fought through satellites, economic pressure, proxy conflicts, autonomous weapons, information warfare, digital surveillance, artificial intelligence making battlefield decisions faster than humans can react. A war without clear front lines, a war that never officially begins, and therefore never officially ends. That is the final warning hidden inside Bacevich's work. Permanent war adapts. It changes shape with technology, with politics, with fear, but its logic survives. And maybe that's why this story matters far beyond America alone. Because when the world's most powerful military treats endless readiness as normal, every rival nation adapts to that reality too. China expands militarily. Russia escalates strategically. Alliances harden. Defense budgets rise globally. One superpower's permanent war doctrine slowly pushes the entire international system toward permanent tension. Not always open conflict, but constant preparation for it. And history shows something dangerous about nations trapped in permanent preparation for war. Eventually, preparation itself can create the very conflict leaders claim they are trying to prevent. That's what makes Washington rules so unsettling. It forces us to ask whether modern superpowers are capable of stepping away from military primacy, or whether the system itself always pulls them back toward confrontation. Because once an empire builds its economy, politics, technology, and identity around global military dominance, walking away may feel impossible. And maybe that is the true tragedy of permanent war. Not only the lives lost on battlefields, but the inability to imagine another path forward. If this video challenged your perspective, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel dives deep into the hidden logic behind wars, military strategy, geopolitics, and the power structures shaping our world. And now tell me in the comments, do you think permanent war is unavoidable for every superpower in history? Or can nations break the cycle before it consumes them?